Welcome back to Tiny Blue Games. My name's of course Csaw or Chris, and today we're talking about Guild Wars 2 in 2023. Today we're looking at a recent update that ArenaNet has provided for kind of the roadmap and the state of Guild Wars 2 in 2023. It looks at kind of a lot of what we can expect in the coming months, but also what we can expect in the long-term run of Guild Wars 2. And similar to a lot of updates they provided over the entire run of the game, this changes things up. It's one thing that we've known about Guild Wars 2 for a while now, is that they're not afraid to really change, in a lot of ways, the identity of the game and what they deliver in terms of content, and this is very much what we're seeing in this post as well. Just before we get into the specifics though, I should mention I am a Guild Wars 2 or ArenaNet partner. Does that mean I won't say anything bad about Guild Wars 2? No, I'll say the good, the bad, the medium, but it does mean there are 2 referral links or sponsored links if you prefer in the comment section below. If you do choose to use either of these links to buy the expansions or try out the game for free, it does help support the channel, which is always greatly appreciated. With that said though, let's jump into the full update. I should also mention that in the background you'll see some footage of me just messing around in game. It doesn't really have anything to do with the update, but it was just kind of some fun stuff I was up to that I figured would fit within the video. Now, the update itself comes from Grouch, the game director. And before I even get into the update itself, I should say I've really enjoyed this direction from Guild Wars 2 that we've seen from Josh. A lot more of these blog style updates on, their process, the immediate future and what we can expect, and just kind of like long-term plans for the game. And I think this is something we've seen in the MMO genre in total, is that a lot of games like Guild Wars 2 and World of Warcraft have started to release these updates that are more blog style, have some roadmaps attached to them, and really give a lot of transparency to the player in terms of what we can expect. I think there's been a lot of pressure from players to kind of have more transparency when it comes to development cycles and stuff like that. But I also think this is something that Final Fantasy XIV has helped inspired with their live letters and, very direct communications on a pretty regular cadence. I think a lot of other MMO companies have looked at this and been like, hey, this works out really well. We should do something like this. Because it has the advantage of kind of letting players know what they can be excited for, but it also, I think, lends a lot of forgiveness when there are changes, especially when, there's a post about it, about why something was delayed or changed or something like that. Players are a lot more understanding if there is this level of transparency compared to some of the other situations in the past where there's been content droughts and just no news for months on end. And the developers might know why all this is happening, but the players just have no transparency. That's when people are more likely to quit, in my opinion. So it's great to see this in general. But now into the news. As we've mentioned, Guild Wars 2 is not afraid of change, and I'd say this is a pretty big shift. The biggest ticket item when reading this is the fact that they are essentially moving away from Living World updates, which was one of the main staple and brand terms that Guild Wars 2 used like pretty early on in its launch. Like I think it was one of the first 2 updates after the game went live in 2012 that they started using the term Living World. So it's pretty big for them to say, hey, we're going to be looking into that and we're going to be changing up how we do that a little bit. So they're moving away from the Living World branding. They're moving to more of these quarterly updates that we see from a lot of the top MMORPGs. We see this kind of in WoW, we see this kind of in Final Fantasy XIV, and they're moving to a quicker expansion cycle with a bit of a reduced cost of the expansion, which I think, if anything, sounds like a bit of a return to their roots in Guild Wars 1. So some very big shifts there, and immediately this solves one of the biggest problems that Guild Wars 2 has, which was how the Living World content was released to players, especially players that weren't playing in the past but want to play now. In the past, you had to, log into the game and actively play a Living World episode in order to claim it for your account and have continued access to it for the future. If you did not do that and you joined the game after the fact, you'd have to go and buy these Living World episodes, either individually or as packages from the gem store. This became a huge issue when people would join the game, buy the expansions, and then find out they're missing a whole bunch of story content that they have to go and pay additionally for. It was one of the biggest friction points when it came to new players joining the game, and it looks like they are looking to do away with this. So going forward, it sounds like you buy the expansion, whatever the current expansion is, and you get access to whatever updates come within that expansion, whatever quarterly updates are. Very, very similar to what you'd see in World of Warcraft or something like that, except you obviously aren't paying a sub fee as well. So it's a pretty good business model. If anything, I think it's just become more value for the players who are purchasing the expansions. Likely what you'd see is a more frequent expansion fee that you have to pay. If it's every year, if it's every 2 years, maybe it's a little bit less money, but you're paying for those expansions more frequently. And I think that's probably how they're going to balance this out. I think it makes a lot of sense too, because with Guild Wars 2 being such a long-standing MMORPG, they do see fluctuations in population, but they've probably got a very dedicated core audience that would pay for these expansions. And if they're able to get revenue from this core audience more frequently, it'll probably help balance out cash flows and stuff like that, as opposed to having, 3 or 4 years without an expansion and then a huge jump in expansion, or forcing people to buy these living world content in a way that's not very desirable. So I think this is a pretty good move in terms of the actual financial sides and the introduction of new players into the franchise. Okay, so we've talked a bit about the structure of updates going forward, but what kind of content can we expect? Now, they've given us some guidance in terms of more immediate future content, and it sounds like a lot of what we've already been experiencing will be continued. They talk about adding new maps, even outside of the expansion itself, which is good. That's something that Living World did. They're talking about adding new fractals, new challenge modes, new strike missions. It seems like they're pretty locked into those core pillars of content. And then one of the bigger things that they do highlight is that these changes to their development cycle are being done to allow them to more properly balance development time amongst all categories of gameplay in Guild Wars 2. One of the things they highlight is that when they were doing this Living World content, essentially all of the Guild Wars 2 development time would go to the next episode of Living World, and it made it very difficult for them to balance expansions, but also other types of gameplay development alongside Living World. So the hope here, I think, is that we'd see a pretty balanced amount of development for things like PvE gameplay, PvP gameplay, if that's SPVP, if that's Worldly World, and then just really having a good balance amongst all of those different types of content, which will be good because that's something that the game definitely has struggled with. And it's also something when you come to the expansion versus, just quarterly updates, it's something that they've struggled with when doing the Living World, is that it would feel like they were all aboard the Living World hype train, and then when eventually an expansion was released, they had to pretty much go silent and prepare this expansion. And then once the expansion released, they had to really just dive back into the Living World. And it seemed like a lot of kind of binary switches between what was being worked on. Whereas now, I think the hope is that with having some team working on these continuous expansions and some team working on some of these continuous quarterly updates, we'll have a better cadence of the total amount of drops that are being added to the game. Because it's certainly something that Guild Wars 2 has struggled with having, dead periods where there isn't anything really interesting coming or that people can be excited for in the game. So hopefully this helps. It's definitely something that all MMORPGs have dealt with, specifically over the last few years with the changes in terms of, people working from home and stuff like that. But it is something that I hope will help smooth over the gameplay going forward. The other really exciting thing about this is the fact that they're, outlining all of this would suggest that Guild Wars 2 has a lot of longevity yet to come. You don't plan out the future of, many years of expansions and content updates without thinking that this game has legs. We know that Guild Wars 2 has had a pretty stable population, and it's certainly among the top 5 MMORPGs. And this kind of gives a vote of confidence from their leadership that, hey, we know we have the player base. We think we have the dedicated player base that would be willing to spend on these expansions pretty frequently, and we're going to deliver on it. So I think really all of this is great news for the long-term story of Guild Wars 2. I'm excited to see, what this actually looks like in terms of the amount of content received in a year, if it actually does move the needle at all, or if it just makes it feel much more planned and intentional, which even if it's just that later option, that's still a benefit for players. I think I've talked on the channel about the types of content I like. I'm certainly someone who likes raids and stuff like that. But I think the strike missions, certainly the most recent one I did on this channel, have shown a good quality of combat and engagement. And if they're able to keep delivering those alongside fractals and other core objects of gameplay, I think they really do have a pretty successful future ahead of them. What I think will be interesting with these new expansions that are shorter in terms of timelines and, a little bit lower scope is if they still deliver some of the main features such as elite specs and stuff like that. Is it fair to expect elite specs for every single profession or class, whatever you want to call them, if it is a yearly expansion or something like that? Or maybe they'll have to change that a little bit in terms of how many they're delivering. All this to say, though, I'm excited to see what comes next for Guild Wars 2. I think this is a very positive outlook from ArenaNet, and if anything, I'm just really happy to see Josh give updates like this and really be transparent with the community. I think that's the best thing that any of these companies can do at this time, and it certainly feels good as a long-term player of Guild Wars 2. But hopefully you enjoyed this video. Leave me your comments on the update. What do you think about this? Are you excited to see this new approach, or are you hesitant to see Living World disappear? I'm sure people will kind of be on either side of that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.